The air broke before the silence did. Not with song, not with prayer, but with collapse. It happened just as the trumpets hushed, just as the golden canopy over the pontifical chair settled into its final position. A Vatican guard, disciplined, immovable, a fixture of the sacred order, swayed, then fell. Hard. His helmet hit the stones with a crack that rang louder than the cathedral bells. For a split second, time disobeyed. No one moved. Not the bishops. Not the cameras. Not even the wind. And then, all at once, movement resumed, scrambling aides, murmuring clergy, flashing reporters. Protocols sputtered to life. But the one man expected to stay aloof, the most protected, the most distant, did the opposite. Pope Leo XIV stepped down from the dais. He did not hesitate. He did not ask. He walked straight into the collapse. The crowd parted as if by force unseen. His white garments brushed the edge of the guard's twitching hand. His knees found the stones. He removed his gloves. He placed one hand over the guard's racing heart, the other cradling the back of his trembling head. Then, the Pope leaned in. He spoke, not to the cameras, not to the crowd, but to the man dying beneath his hands. Only those closest could hear it. Just a few words, soft and burning. But whatever he whispered, it brought the square to stillness. Even the air held its breath. And across the world, through satellite feeds, live streams, replays, the question echoed. What did the Pope say that made every witness fall silent? Before we go further, comment where you're watching from. And if this doesn't stir something sacred in you, tell us in the comments why. But if it does, don't scroll. Subscribe now. Before the headlines. Before the outrage and the praise. Before the camera angles were dissected and the whisper analyzed in 8 languages, there was only one man on his knees, and another in collapse. But to understand what truly happened in that moment, one must look backward, into the lives that collided on the marble floor of the Vatican. Pope Leo XIV had not always been a pontiff. Years earlier, he was simply Father Matteo Leone, a parish priest with skin blistered by African sun and lungs filled with desert dust. He spent over a decade in forgotten places, preaching not from pulpits, but beside mass graves and burned-out clinics. His vestments were often torn, his chalice sometimes a tin cup. He baptized with river water, heard confessions through gunfire, and buried children with bare hands. When he was elected supreme pontiff, some cardinals wept in disbelief. A missionary pope. A man who had never climbed the ladder of ecclesiastical diplomacy, but climbed mountains to deliver food. They expected him to soften into ceremony. He did not. He wore the garments, but they never wore him. And yet, for all his firmness on doctrine and scandal, Pope Leo remained elusive, hard to categorize. He dined simply, spoke rarely, and when he did, it was with a kind of weight that made silence feel like an answer. He had not been tested in the eyes of the world. Not yet. Until the guard fell. Alessandro Moretti was not just a body in a uniform. He had served 4 popes. 20 years in the Swiss Guard. Before that, a tour in the Italian army, where he saw friends dismembered by roadside bombs and learned to sleep with one eye open. He returned home alive but not whole. His conversion came in silence, not song. He spoke little of war, but when he stood post at the Vatican gates, he stood with the weight of memory on his shoulders. Those who knew him described him as the man who never blinked. His loyalty wasn't loud, it was lived. And yet, the signs were there. Fatigue in his posture. A tremor in his right hand during Mass. He was a man unraveling in private, until his body gave out in public. The setting itself had been flawless. The Vatican's annual feast of the Chair of St. Peter had drawn pilgrims from 5 continents. Choirs echoed through Bernini's colonnades. Incense rose like a veil between heaven and earth. White and gold banners rippled in the breeze as the Pope began his slow procession beneath a canopy of gold brocade. It was meant to be a celebration of legacy, continuity, power. Instead, it became a revelation of character. Because when Alessandro collapsed, twitching, sweating, lips turning blue, most of the men in robes turned to their aides or froze behind formality. Security teams radioed. Cameras pivoted. Vatican protocol flared into motion like a machine long rehearsed. But Pope Leo, he did what no script instructed. He walked away from the center. He walked toward the crisis. There was no hesitation, no glancing sideways for approval. He moved with the focus of a surgeon and the gentleness of a father. When his knees hit the stone, it wasn't performance. It was instinct. And as he whispered into Alessandro's ear, as the world watched in rapt stillness, something ancient passed between them. Something wordless and holy. The kind of moment that would not be explained in press briefings, but would linger in hearts longer than any policy or proclamation. This was not a health emergency. This was an unveiling. In that simple act of kneeling, Pope Leo XIV told the world what kind of shepherd he truly was. Not just a man who wore white, but a man who bled with the broken. He chose humanity over hierarchy. Presence over protocol. He chose to bend. If this moment doesn't make you believe in divine leadership, say it below. We want to hear you. But if it does, if your spirit stirred even slightly, you know what to do. Subscribe now. Let this not be just another video. Let it be a turning point. The stillness did not last. Within hours, headlines blurred across television screens and social feeds. Unprecedented response from the Pope. Papal protocol broken during emergency. Leo XIV kneels, compassion or calculated move. From Rome to Rio, the images were played and replayed, the Pope's hand resting on the guard's chest, his robes darkened by sweat and blood. The Vatican had said nothing. But the world? The world filled the silence with its own noise. Journalists, some respectful, others hungry, began circling the narrative. In press briefings and studio panels, the language was measured, but the undertone sharp. A veteran BBC correspondent asked, was this the spontaneous gesture of a pastor? Or the rehearsed optics of a global leader? A former Vatican advisor mused, there's always intent behind papal visibility. He knew the cameras were there. In polished studios with panoramic backdrops of the basilica, commentators dissected the moment with surgical detachment. It was moving, one said, but perhaps too theatrical. Another chimed in, this isn't about theology. It's about image. And the image was powerful, too powerful to be accidental. They did not question the man's holiness. They questioned his timing. Even inside the curia, the murmurs grew. Some prelates, uncomfortable with the rawness of the moment, privately voiced concerns. Had the Pope weakened the institution by making himself so available? We are not emergency responders, one bishop said. We are shepherds of eternal truths, not emotional entanglements. And yet, Pope Leo said nothing, for 2 full days. Then came Sunday. St. Peter's was full, as always. But this time, eyes watched not out of devotion, but curiosity. The world waited to see whether the man who knelt in crisis would speak in calm. He did. Slowly. Clearly. Without notes. His voice did not rise. It never did. But the weight of his words bent the air. There are those who ask if compassion is appropriate for a pontiff, he began. There are those who wonder if the shepherd should kneel beside the injured lamb, or wait for the medics. He paused. I say, if a shepherd cannot kneel, he is no shepherd at all. The crowd stilled. The plaza, usually filled with clicking shutters and subtle movement, held its breath. I did not kneel because I am holy. I knelt because I am human. And because the God I serve, once knelt to wash feet. He spoke of suffering, not as metaphor, but as memory. He described holding dying orphans during an outbreak in Sudan. He remembered the shivering widow in the Andes who gave him her last piece of bread. He told of the time he sat with a man moments before execution and whispered the gospel into trembling ears. Then he said it plainly, leadership without wounds is not leadership. It is theater. He said no names. He leveled no accusations. But every critic heard themselves reflected in the silence that followed. He closed with a line so simple, it seemed ancient. We do not serve to be seen. We are seen because we serve. The crowd erupted, not in claps, but in tears. And around the world, those who had watched him kneel now heard why he did. If kindness is weakness to you, explain it below. Say it openly. But if this depth moved you, even for a moment, then subscribe now, and follow Circle of God's Glory. Not because you agree with every word, but because you still believe that truth wears humility. But the storm had only begun to gather. As Pope Leo XIV's words echoed through the square and reverberated across media platforms, responses hardened. What had begun as curiosity turned sharp. In the realm of commentary, the tone shifted from inquiry to accusation. Voices from secular governance, particularly in the West, began to weigh in, not as observers, but as critics. Senator Howard Grimley of the United States, an Ivy League statesman known for his carefully curated skepticism of religious influence, took to a Sunday panel show with a tone of controlled disdain. There is a difference, he said, eyes narrowed beneath studio lights, between compassion and chaos. The Vatican is a sovereign institution. The Pope is not a nurse. He is a head of state. He leaned forward. To break protocol, to abandon security formation, to kneel, live, on camera, that's not humility. That's theater. Political theater. And frankly, it sends the wrong message to the watching world. That emotion comes before order. That sentiment overrides structure. The host, uncomfortable but intrigued, asked the senator if he questioned the Pope's sincerity. I question his judgment, Grimley replied. And when judgment falters in leaders of that stature, the consequences ripple far beyond Vatican walls. Across oceans, others echoed his concern in softer tones, columnists, diplomats, academics. They called the Pope's action symbolically loaded, politically naive, and in some corners, a calculated distraction from institutional issues. And yet, the man at the center of it all remained silent, until a scheduled address before a gathering of interfaith leaders at Castel Gandolfo. He stood in a garden where ancient olive trees whispered over cobblestone, and before any greetings, he spoke directly to the fire that had been lit. There are those, he said, who are deeply disturbed that I knelt beside a man in crisis. They worry that I broke tradition. That I stepped outside the frame of authority. And I understand that concern. His voice was calm, measured, unhurried. But let me ask this, what is tradition without mercy? What is protocol, if it does not bow to the suffering of a brother? He paused. The silence that followed was not empty, it was listening. I was a missionary long before I wore this ring, he continued. I have buried children who died before they could speak. I have shared bread with men who had not eaten in days. I have kissed the foreheads of the dying when no one else would touch them. And never did I consult a rulebook before doing so. He looked up at the gathered clerics, rabbis, imams, and monks. Compassion often defies logic. It moves in the spaces between laws. It is inconvenient. It is unscripted. But it is also the only thing that makes the law worth writing. He let the words breathe. Then added, without raising his voice, politics divide. The gospel unites. The moment settled like a benediction. But not everyone received it. The senator issued a formal statement within hours. So did a handful of diplomats. Quietly, some bishops met behind closed doors, worried that the Pope was becoming too emotional, too human, too visible. But Leo XIV did not retreat. He issued no apology. He made no correction. Because in his silence, there was nothing left to prove. Still not convinced that humility is power? Then speak. Say it in the comments. Defend your doubt. But if your heart is stirring, if even a part of you feels the truth beneath these words, then don't let this moment pass. Subscribe now to Circle of God's Glory. Let this be more than content. Let it be a calling. The confrontation did not happen behind closed doors. It unfolded beneath studio lights, broadcasted to millions. The Vatican had agreed, reluctantly, to a long-planned global forum on faith and power. Representatives from every continent, every major religion, every ideological sphere. It was meant to be civil, ceremonial, a conversation of dignity. But civility is fragile. And ceremony, when met with ego, crumbles. The forum's host was Lucien Drex, a sharp-jawed political analyst turned commentator, whose fame came not from wisdom but from interruption. He made his name skewering elected officials, spiritual leaders, and academics alike. He was intelligent, polished, and utterly convinced of his own clarity. Midway through the forum, as Pope Leo XIV calmly answered a question about the role of faith in crisis response, Drex cut in. "Holiness," he began, the word laced with a grin, "I have to ask, at what point does compassion become compromise?" The Pope turned to him slowly. Not startled. Not stiff. Just present. Drex pressed further. "When you left the podium to kneel beside a man in medical distress, was that impulse, or agenda? You've said nothing political. You've offered no institutional defense. No damage control. Some say you've become a symbol, but no longer a leader." He leaned forward, the lights catching his smirk. "So tell us plainly, are you a pope, or just a puppet of weakness?" The room fell into what could only be called silence with weight. Not the absence of sound. The presence of tension. The camera cut to the Pope. He did not blink. He did not clear his throat. He did not look for notes. Instead, his voice, low, grounded, entered the room like a current under still water. "You ask if I am a puppet," he said, "because I chose to kneel." He allowed the words to hang. Then he stood. "I was in Aleppo," he said. "Before I was Pope. During the bombing. Before the ceasefire. Before the world pretended to remember Syria." He turned slightly, not to Drex, but to the audience beyond the camera. "I held a child. 8 years old. No name on his clothes. His legs were gone beneath the knees. His blood soaked through the linen we wrapped him in. He kept saying one thing, over and over, 'Don't leave me. Please don't leave me.'" The Pope paused, not for drama, but because the words cost something to speak. I stayed until his heart stopped. Until the breath fled his body. And then I held him for an hour after, because I wanted heaven to find him in someone's arms. Then he turned back to Drex, and his voice, though gentle, cut like a scalpel. "You call it naive to protect the innocent. I call it sacred." He stepped closer. "You confuse hardness with strength. But I have seen men with guns tremble beside mothers in grief. I have seen the strongest break where the merciful endure. No applause. No music. Just breath, drawn, held, broken. And if you think leadership means distance," the Pope continued, "then you have never led. You have only observed. Leadership is not the sound of boots marching. It is the sound of tears falling, unseen, and choosing to respond." Drex said nothing. Because what could he say to a man who had walked through fire and emerged not with pride, but with scars he chose to show? The room didn't clap. It wept. Quietly. The kind of silence only truth can summon. If this moment doesn't shake you, then drop your reason in the comments. We will read it. But if it does, if the tears came and you don't know why, then show your alignment. Subscribe now to Circle of God's Glory. Let this not be something you merely watched. Let it be something you remembered. The stillness after the Pope's words was not the end. It was the beginning of unraveling. Drex had no rebuttal. His smirk had vanished, replaced not by anger, but by something closer to confusion, maybe shame. He turned slightly in his seat, as if the weight of the studio lights had grown unbearable. But Pope Leo did not gloat. He did not lean into the silence for applause. He simply continued. With a tone not of triumph, but of clarity, as if finally, the space had been made sacred enough for truth to walk in. There is a lie, he said softly, that modern men carry. A quiet, polished lie, that mercy is a performance. That those who kneel must be weak. That those who feel must be led. He looked toward Drex again, not with disdain, but with mourning. But what you mistake for weakness is a strength your world no longer understands. He stepped slightly forward. No teleprompter, no notes. You ask why I knelt. You ask why I made myself so visibly small. You ask if I am a puppet. But I say this to you, and to every chamber of power that hears my voice tonight, you confuse engagement with endorsement. You think that if we touch the wounded, we must agree with their sin. That if we sit beside the fallen, we must have fallen ourselves. He lifted his hand, not as a gesture, but as if he were holding something unseen. But the Christ I follow dined with traitors. He washed the feet of cowards. He let prostitutes weep on his skin, and he called the poor his brothers. The lights in the room seemed to dim, though no one touched a switch. And if that example makes you uncomfortable, perhaps your discomfort is not with me. Perhaps it is with him. Then came the moment no one expected. The Pope paused, then turned back to the image projected on the studio screen behind him. The image of Guard Alessandro collapsing on the Vatican stones. I did not kneel out of optics. I did not kneel for theater. I knelt because I knew something none of you did. He looked across the panel. That man, Alessandro Moretti, lost his son to suicide just 12 days before. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Someone gasped. Another lowered their eyes. He showed up to serve anyway, the Pope continued. He told no one. Not even his superiors. He stood at that gate holding the weight of his son's final breath in his chest. And when his knees gave out, it wasn't weakness. It was grief finally finding a crack. His voice tightened, but it did not break. I knew. He had come to me privately. We prayed together in silence. He didn't ask for help. He asked for forgiveness. And I gave him none, because he needed none. Now the room was still. Truly still. The kind of stillness that comes after deep mourning. I knelt, the Pope said, because in that moment, heaven was closer to the man on the ground than to any of us standing over him. I knelt because Christ would have. There were no questions after that. Only breathing. And in some corners of the room, tears. A cameraman lowered his lens. A bishop behind the scenes bowed his head. One of the young clerics in the audience buried his face in his hands and wept. Not because he was weak, but because he had forgotten what strength looked like. This isn't just news. This is truth. And if you still won't subscribe, then explain in the comments. But if you will, do it boldly. Not out of obligation. But because something in you has awakened. This is Circle of God's Glory. And this is what it means to remember who we are. The fire had passed. The air, once thick with challenge and posturing, now held a different weight, something closer to reverence. But the Pope did not remain standing in that silence. He stepped back from the edge of confrontation, as if retreating from a battlefield he never wished to enter in the first place. He folded his hands before him, not in resignation, but in reflection. And when he spoke again, his voice was no longer carved from steel. It was warm earth, soft rain, the echo of a chapel after the choir has gone. This was never about debate, he said. And it was never about proving a point. He looked to no one, and yet he spoke to all. This is about the world we are building. Together. His gaze swept the room, not with triumph, but tenderness. Whether you wear robes or uniforms, run governments or households, stand behind cameras or behind altars, we are not strangers to grief. Not one of us. He allowed the truth to settle before he continued. You do not have to believe in everything I say. You do not have to kneel where I kneel. But if you believe that no human sorrow should be ignored, then we already agree on more than we differ. He turned slightly toward the cameras, toward the audience not in the room, but across screens and cities, languages and continents. This moment is not Catholic. It is not Roman. It is human. He paused, not for effect, but to find the weight of his own words. I speak now not as a pope, but as a man who has buried children in foreign soil, who has listened to the final words of soldiers, who has washed the feet of addicts, atheists, and saints alike. And I tell you, there is no power greater than compassion that does not shout. He raised his hand slightly, not in blessing, yet, but in invitation. In a world that rewards noise, may you practice quiet. In a culture that glorifies rage, may you remember the courage of gentleness. In this age of rapid judgment, may your first instinct be not to argue, but to ask. He drew breath, deeply, and the studio held it with him. We do not need more shouting, he said, gently. We need more hearts listening. Then, he bowed his head. No cue. No orchestra. No scripture citation. Just silence. And into that silence, a prayer, not spoken aloud but felt, for the wounded, for the loud, for the doubters, the defenders, the dying, and the desperate. For the guard whose grief could no longer hide, and the people who watched a pope kneel, unsure what it meant. That they may find peace. That we may remember who we are. That the world we are building may be one where no one collapses unseen. And in that quiet, something holy happened, not on a screen, but inside. Do you want more shouting? Or more hearts listening? Choose your answer. And in doing so, choose whether you'll subscribe to this channel. Or share below, truthfully, why you won't. This is Circle of God's Glory. Where silence still speaks. And now the lights dimmed, not by design, but by atmosphere. The room no longer held debate or defense. It held memory. The Pope's words had ceased. The silence that followed had run its course. And yet, something deeper remained, an ache, a reckoning. Not only in the studio, but in every living room, every crowded cafe, every hospital corridor where the broadcast still played. The camera lingered. And though the Pope had stepped away, his presence remained like a breath held in prayer. Then, the narrator's voice, quiet, steady, returned. Not to explain, but to ask. What would you have done if you saw that guard collapse? Would you have called for help, and kept walking? Would you have waited for protocol, or reached instinctively? Would you have stepped over him? Or would you have knelt, like Christ? The question isn't rhetorical. It is real. It is yours. In this story, there were cameras and politics, microphones and theology. But in the end, it came down to a single gesture, a man in white robes choosing to bend toward another made of dust and burden. And that choice, so simple, so unscripted, is waiting for all of us. This is not about religion. This is about response. To suffering. To grief. To the unspoken pain that people carry quietly, while standing tall. So tell us, what would you have done? And please, speak honestly. The comment section is open, not for noise, but for truth. For quiet admissions. For heartfelt disagreement. For longing. But if this story did something to you, if it reached that untouched part of your spirit where conscience whispers and memory lives, then don't leave it unfinished. Join Circle of God's Glory. Let this space be more than a platform. Let it be a place where the holy interrupts the expected. Where the forgotten are remembered. Where bending low is the highest act of all. And if you still won't subscribe, tell us why. Not with pride, but with honesty. Because whether you kneel or not, we are all standing on sacred ground. May we all seek truth with humble hearts.